Here's a question. Can we end world hunger? What type of leadership will it require, and how soon could it happen? According to the United Nations, over 2 billion people lack regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. That's 1 out of every 4 of us. This includes 820 million people who are experiencing severe food insecurity. The forces driving hunger around the world include conflict, climate volatility, and broadening economic inequalities. Finding solutions will require the thought leadership of visionaries who are well-connected, knowledgeable, innovative, and hardworking. In this episode, we're joined by Devry Boughner Vorwerk, CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies. Devry's a pivotal force in the development of opportunities to build coalitions and shape leadership in their organizations toward a more sustainable future. She serves and chairs numerous boards throughout the world, promoting economic development with a special emphasis on reduction of hunger worldwide. My name is Alan Fine. Welcome to the Global Benefit Podcast, where we lead conversations toward the health, harmony, and security of the world. Media addiction is a major problem. Being responsible media creators, we recommend you take regular breaks from all media, including this show, to develop yourself and be an active participant in the world. Excessive media consumption will negatively impact your life, so please watch responsibly. All right, Devry, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us about yourself.
Wow, I thought you were going to start with something a little bit easier. It's a good open-ended question.
Yeah.
Let me see where I'll take the answer. Actually, thanks. Thanks for the interest, because when I talk about myself, I think what comes through is my life's mission. And I grew up in the Salinas Valley of California, which, for those that aren't familiar with California, it's about 2 hours south of San Francisco, about 20 minutes inland from the coast.
Okay.
It's an incredibly fertile valley, and if you've ever read John Steinbeck, who's my favorite author in the world, that's where he comes from. And so we call it Steinbeck country.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so his words are all over the valley. And it's a small farm town I grew up in called Gonzales, which is about 95% Mexican origin.
Okay.
And anything that you would put in a salad, Alan, we grow out there.
Oh, interesting.
So I grew up around the fields. I saw and understood the complexities of food production from a very young age.
Wow.
And marveled at the beautiful rows of produce, but also those working in the fields, the backbreaking work. So I was, surrounded by agriculture in a very real way from a very young age.
Wow.
Yeah.
From our previous conversations and my reading about you, I know you're very passionate about solving world hunger. Mm-hmm. What are your goals regarding world hunger, and how are you acting on them?
Well, hunger has no reason to exist even today. There's enough food in the world today to feed every person on this planet, over 7.2 billion people. So my goal is to see the end of hunger, not just in my lifetime, but at an accelerated pace. And we can talk a bit about how I'm working with others to accomplish that.
I should just mention one thing too. We're at 7.6 billion, believe it or not, at this point. Just to clarify. And the U.S. Census Bureau projects, and the United Nations too, projects that by 2030 we'll have 8.6 billion. So
population is on the rise, right?
Yes,
so thank you for actually highlighting the fact that it's growing. And by 2050, we're predicting around 10 billion. And so the food industry and food advocates are centrally focused on how will we feed a growing population. And I'm focused on how do we feed them today and tomorrow.
What do you think are the most pressing issues facing agriculture today?
It's a spectrum of issues, and they're all having to be dealt with at the same time. So one thing I like to do is back up and talk about how we should currently marvel at the fact that we are feeding a global population. We're not feeding the entire population. There's about 821 million people that are going hungry, the 2019 statistics from the World Food Program. Hunger is actually on the rise after a bit of a dip over the last few years. In absolute terms, it's on the rise.
Are there specific regions that are affected?
Specifically, the concentration of hunger, malnutrition, and we're talking chronic hunger, and for children, stunting, and when I say malnutrition, it's a double-edged sword. It's not just that people aren't getting enough calories; they're not getting enough of the right kinds of calories. So nutrition is a huge issue. It's concentrated in Asia and Africa as the big pockets of hunger.
The United Nations projects that by the end of this century, Africa is going to have over 5 billion people. Sounds pretty serious.
It's absolutely serious. And when I talk about regions of the world and where hunger is concentrated, one thing I want to put in perspective, however, is that hunger is in every community worldwide. So let's not forget we even have that, chronic hunger, food insecurity, malnutrition here in the United States. It's often called hidden hunger. In fact, I didn't completely answer your question about all the issues, but let me mention last week I was out at the University of California at Davis, where I serve on the Agriculture Issues Board, and I was touring the school farm, which is a 22-acre area where the students will come out and get their hands in the dirt and actually learn about food production, et cetera. And there was a whole area, a whole set of acreage set aside for the food insecure students on campus. And the fact that there are students that are actually allowed to come out to the farm and glean the produce because they themselves can't provide for their own needs.
Wow. Well, you grew up in Salinas,
Gonzales.
In Gonzales. But you mentioned that it is close to San Francisco, and we know there's big tent cities in California now, especially San Francisco is plagued with that as well.
Well, I think what we're seeing is massive inequality. So inequality is growing in a significant way. Food is at the center of inequality. I mean, the access issue is poverty, and the massive inequality that's taking place is that they're in a cycle of poverty. And when I go back to my home state, in fact, I go back often. I don't even recognize the San Francisco that I used to know as a student, where we would go on trips, et cetera, because it's you can see the inequality. You see the great economic growth that has come in. You see the tech industry that has come in and created a lot of jobs, and there's a lot of good that has come from those investments. But at the same time, what I also see is that those investments have pushed the challenge even down the valley to ours, because affordable housing is not there. So when you see people are moving further and further south, even down to our area, to actually have affordable housing, and then they're trying to kind of drive to get to their jobs. I mean, there's a huge set of constraints on people to live and to actually afford to live. And at the center of that is people have to make choices sometimes about what they will eat, how often they eat, et cetera. So it's becoming I think it's a huge issue. The congressman from my home state, son of Leon Panetta, Jimmy Panetta, who was actually a prosecutor in our area, he's centrally focused on these issues. He's at the heart of agriculture, affordable housing, student debt. We have a university there. So he understands the nexus of all of these issues.
Yeah, and we were speaking about homeless, but you were in what you were describing, you were merging into talking just about that there is a large segment of our population that's food and shelter insecure. From what I understand, it's approximately 1 in 3 right now in the United States that's food and shelter insecure.
It depends on how the statistics that you use, and so the UN statistics have hovered between 1 in 6 or 1 in 8. You say 1 in 3, depending on how you define food insecure etc. The point is that it's not very far when you put yourself around a table of 3 or 6 or 8 people, one of them is having challenges feeding themselves and their families on a daily basis, because we can't just think about solving the hunger issue. Great, we've solved it and it's gone. It's an everyday issue. People have to eat every day of their lives to sustain a healthy lifestyle.
Well, you just think about what a typical grocery run costs and what minimum wage is at. The fact that, you can walk into a grocery store and most of the items are like between $5 and $10, and that creates probably tremendous hardship for those people that are constrained like that.
I'll just add to that that the cost of the food basket in the United States is the lowest relative to other parts of the world. So on average, U.S. consumers spend about 10% of their income on food. So we are fortunate here to have an abundance of affordable food.
That's a good point, because I noticed when I was in Ukraine that people are earning, I'm thinking on average, maybe $100 to $200 a month, but the cost of groceries is the same.
Mm-hmm. So
so they're growing their own food. And
some people are spending, 80, 90% of what they make on food in other parts of the world, which is why you asked about early on. So tell me about yourself. One of the issues that I am persistent on is global trade. A persistent advocate for trade. And why? Because we have to be able to move food across borders. We have to make food affordable. We have to make it accessible. And
how are we doing in that regard?
Well, I would say that I mentioned Africa, I mentioned Asia. There are huge pockets of the world where food is just not flowing freely.
Now, I saw that you're on you're chair of some boards, like one associated with Turkey, one associated with Cuba. Maybe tell us more about that. And I assume there's some correlation here with all of this too.
There's an absolute correlation because at my core, I believe that food should not be used as a weapon. And the challenge in moving food around the world and ensuring that it's not just about food, being able to move capital, so that you can deploy capital to create productive food systems in other countries. The challenge to all of that, moving food and capital, and even services in the industry, is that sometimes governments aren't getting along. And so when there's government friction, that creates difficulty for the private sector to move food across borders, or what's needed to invest in those industries worldwide. And so you mentioned Cuba. Several years ago, I worked with a colleague of mine, Paul Johnson, and he and I founded the U.S. Agriculture Coalition for Cuba. Highly controversial, because we'd had, at the time, it was going on nearly 60 years of sanctions on Cuba, where we were not trading 90 miles south of us. It's a $2 billion market down there. And they're importing from Europe, they're importing from other parts of the world at obviously higher costs, when we could be exporting down there much more affordably for the Cuban people. And so when I took that challenge on, I knew that it was coming in the center of a political, storm where not everybody would agree. And my mantra is, it's better to sit and engage. And there are real people on the other side of that border, 12 million people who need access to affordable food every day. And if we take a look, fast forward now that we've actually rolled back some of the positive opportunities that we had even 4 years ago to begin engaging in trade, you take a look now, Cuba's suffering from a food shortage situation. And those are real lives. In the case of Turkey, there are geopolitical challenges, but
we also have some friction presently with Turkey as well.
Absolutely.
On a whole variety of bases.
Absolutely. But this is where the private sector has an opportunity to step in and set expectations of our governments that while they're trying to sort out their geopolitics and their difficult issues, we still need to have commercial relations.
It's interesting when I think about all of the countries that I've traveled to, and I know that you're very well traveled. In every country I've gone to, no matter where it is in the world, what I found is a bunch of nice people everywhere. There's a lot of people that never travel more than 20 miles away from where they live. And so they have certain perceptions of, these people over here must be different than us. But, and it's an interesting experience too, teaching here at the University of Minnesota, having students from pretty much every country in the world, probably other than North Korea. But I find that all of them have the same interests. They want to live a good life. They want to make their parents proud. Most of them want to have families. They want to enjoy from the abundance of life.
Yeah.
And what I've found in a lot of places is a lack of hope. I'm wondering what observations you've made in relationship to that as well.
I think you're absolutely right. We're here on this earth to support one another. And when you travel and you look somebody in the eye, it's very difficult to hate that person. It's very difficult to come from a position of anger and mistrust. When we back up and we think about countries and nationalistic approaches, and it becomes a lot easier to detach yourself. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned North Korea, for example. It's easy to think of them way over there in Asia, in North Asia. But when we start to realize that there's 25 million people in that country that are food insecure, and then we start to dig in around their daily lives and their daily challenges.
It's terrible.
So why would I personally be a proponent of the U.S. and North Korea speaking? Because there's 25 million people on the other side of that conversation that don't have a seat at the table. And at the end of the day, we know exactly what they need. We need to move them up the rungs of the economic ladder. We need to provide them access to opportunity. We need to integrate them into the global system in a way that allows them to live not just a meaningful life,
right,
but at a very basic level, it affords them their human rights.
Fundamentally, it's just this idea that all of us are children at heart. Mm-hmm. We just want to be cared for. And no matter how old we are. It's interesting. I was thinking about an article I was reading about you from The Hill, where I think you'd met there's some dignitary from another country that when you came together, it was almost like you were family. And this world is a social system, right? Mm-hmm. So what's your secret for building relationships the way that you do?
I think I meet people where they are. And we're all interesting, complex, complicated individuals. But the more time I spend with people in different communities, in different countries, and listen and try to understand where they're coming from, the stronger relationships I begin to develop. And I've had an opportunity to travel the world, to work around the world, to engage with people, and I've learned over time that it really is about listening, meeting them where they are, understanding their intentions and where they'd like to go, and then finding a way to engage them from that base. And it was actually my sister recently described, Devry, you operate with a huge amount of integrity. And I thought about that for a while. And I would think that would probably show up as part of my personal brand. Part of that is that when I say I meet people where they are, please don't think it means I'm a diplomat completely and completely sort of insincere. I share who I am, and I also express how I feel, and I'm not afraid to put challenges into the middle of a conversation or a relationship. And I think that's where the integrity component comes in, and why over time people are willing to engage me and trust me on the issues.
Wow, and that absolutely comes through. Well, we're going to take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
And we'll be back shortly.
Great.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, welcome back. We're here with Devry Boughner Vorwerk, CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies. And just wanted to ask you, what would you say have been the greatest successes of modern agriculture in the last couple decades?
You want to say last couple decades? Because I could back all the way up to the beginning of time and say, look, we started out as hunters and gatherers. And one of the most...
What if we were hunters and gatherers today? How many people could this planet support?
We could spend a lot of time talking about that. It would be a completely different societal framework, which is why about 12,000 years ago, we started to see the modernization where we moved as a society to, as opposed to just hunting and gathering, to modern practices. And that's where we began to see some of the first types of hybrids coming into play. I mean, the human ingenuity that came into
Actually, we see it in the Bible.
You see it probably in every religious text.
That's true.
I'm often sitting in church and realizing that the sermon that day or the readings that day are founded on some element of food and agriculture. So if you in terms of, okay, how do you treat the people that are working for you in the field, or, the loaves and fishes? I mean, the entire text has central to it is food. So you asked me what's been sort of some of the modern developments in the last 20 years.
Well, actually, I kind of like this idea, though, sort of taking our listeners through this journey that we've been on, because most people don't realize they just go to the store and they buy some food and they don't really think about the modern miracle of agriculture.
The modern miracle. And so where that began to really modernize was during the Middle Ages, as I mentioned, right? And then you fast forward to the industrial era. And
when you say Middle Ages, we're talking about maybe irrigation systems?
I mean, all irrigation systems, new ways of planting and harvesting. I mean, it was all taking place at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I want to bring up that around 1798, it got challenged. Oh, gee, our population is growing, by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Malthus. Have you heard of him?
No.
So I was first introduced to this when I got to UC Davis and started my degree program in agricultural economics. And my jaw dropped because here's Thomas Malthus in 1798 telling the rest of society, we are set to be doomed. And he showed the curve of population growth, and then he showed, and look at how we're going to be able to respond on the agricultural side. And even though new technologies are coming into place, the new technologies are actually making people's lives a little bit better, which hence means people are having more kids, and we're caught, and we're not going to be able to survive.
Sure.
And what I'll say is, what he didn't count on was human ingenuity. He was not an optimist, and certainly he didn't have faith that we as humans would be able to solve this. And so it was actually in the last 120 years, we've had the greatest technological revolution in food and agriculture than we'd had in all those years I'd mentioned before, bringing on tractors and this gets to where we have complexities in the food system. But when we think about tractors and pesticides and new technologies, new waves of farming, I mean, if you were to just zero in on one element of food and agriculture, we could have, actually an entire lifetime of conversations around how do you manage pests? I mean, the integrated pest management that's out there, and new ways of addressing pests that are coming from different parts of the world. I mean, the food system is the most technologically advanced system in the world, and it just keeps getting more advanced. And when we were talking earlier about global population on the rise, I mean, there's nothing different. Back in Malthus's point, it was on the rise.
But that food system, though, that's technologically advanced, is it uniformly technologically advanced across the board, across the world?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There are massive inequities in access to technology and access to capital and access to education. I mean, there's massive inequities. And when we think about, you had mentioned about the one of the greatest population increases will be in Africa. Africa has yet to unlock its food production potential. There's reason to be optimistic. Something's been a bit unnoticed in the last 6 to 8 months, but Africa, actually, the African nations and the African leaders have stepped up and signed a comprehensive free trade agreement, which will begin to stitch together those economies. They're seeing, okay, we've tried to kind of get into this self-sufficient mode of not moving food across borders. Many of those countries have been unwilling to accept technologies like GMOs. And so at this moment in time now, they're saying, wait a second, if we think of ourselves together, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so there's a reason to be optimistic and for the world to be encouraging Africa to, these different countries in Africa to sit together and say, how do we stitch together an agricultural economy that's going to be able to be part of feeding the extra 5 billion?
In relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals that have been formulated by the United Nations, one of those goals is addressing world hunger. Are these goals exclusively separate from one another? Or are these goals intertwined with one another?
So,
and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what these goals are.
Right. So these goals are called the Sustainable Development Goals. So for those who have not been introduced to them, the way I like to describe them is they're the best marketing campaign I've ever seen to end extreme poverty. Why? Because the creators of the goals and all the countries that signed on to them have sort of simplified how we should be thinking about the complexity of extreme poverty. There are 17 goals. All of them, you're right, are intertwined because at the ultimate goal is to end extreme poverty by 2030. So if you get these goals, you concentrate in on this, each one of them, and then some of them cross over. What if we collectively take action to meet these goals? We will end extreme poverty by 2030. So that's what they are.
Now, how many people live in extreme poverty today? Well,
I can tell you how many people are food insecure, which is about 821 million. And being food insecure is a consequence of poverty. Poverty is a root cause of that. So we can describe stratifications of poverty, but that's how I think of it, right? If you don't have enough resources to feed yourself on a daily basis, that is extreme. So.
Now, C.K. Prahlad talks about a bottom of the pyramid market too, that is actually 4 billion that are living on $2 a day. Is that true today? I don't know.
A huge portion. If C.K. Prahlad back then when he wrote his book said 4 billion, then there is a huge set of society that's living on between $1 and $2 a day. That's important to note because between $2 and $10, if you can visualize taking people who are living at the bottom of the pyramid, $1 to $2 a day, and you move them between $2 and $10, that's when you start to see diets change. That's when those individuals can go from eating mostly starch-based diets to adding protein to their diet. It's between $2 and $10 where you start to see protein being added to the diet, switching from just calories.
Yeah.
So briefly, these goals, goal number 1 is to end extreme poverty. All the other 16 of those goals contribute to it. Second goal, SDG 2, is zero hunger. And then I brought these along for your guests, and maybe we'll be able to put them up. But you have, good health and well-being is goal number 3, and quality education, number 4. SDG 5, gender equality. Number 6, clean water and sanitation. So you start to see how all of these things are linked together. And you have like number 13, climate action. You mentioned, Alan, that you've seen these extreme, we've seen in the past, droughts and famine. And in the 80s when I was growing up, it was Ethiopia. But today we've got an issue in Australia.
Oh my gosh!
Which was
more than a billion,
is a major food producer, is having extreme drought. In California,
more than a billion animals have perished so far. It's just we don't really think about the ramifications too on our wildlife populations, and then how
Well, and in the context of how I spend my time focused on food, I was reflecting this morning before we came together. If you go back in history, you've had things like the Irish famine, right? So we've always had it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we limit ourselves to thinking about, well, gee, the Irish should have solved it by themselves, or Ethiopia should have solved it by themselves, or Australia should solve it by themselves, we're actually not thinking about the system as a global food system. So why the SDGs are so important, and we focus in on collective goals here, is that we're in it together. Mm-hmm. So in a case where a country's going through a drought, or we've got conflict, and we need to ensure that we're all getting, food into that conflict zone, we've got to be able to do it together. And what's most important is trade, being able to move food across borders, not using food as weapons. So you see how it all starts to kind of come together. Mm-hmm. And when people don't have food, their serotonin levels go down. When their serotonin levels go down, it's documented. Serotonin levels going down across a society increases conflict. If I were running a country, my fundamental belief is that every leader of every country, every community, every state, every community, their number one priority should be ending hunger. If a community leader, a mayor of a city, for example, here in the U.S., says, I'm going to make my number one priority to ensure that we have got food security across my city. What happens when people are well-fed, they can all of a sudden stop focusing so much on just getting enough calories. They're well-fed, their body physically responds. Mm-hmm. Their productivity levels go up. As I mentioned earlier, their serotonin levels go up. Mm-hmm. As part of creating a more healthy existence within the community, a more peaceful existence, so that their community is thriving, it all goes back to, are my people being fed, and fed well enough so that they can bring about the best of themselves?
Oh, that's powerful.
You take that to a global scale. When I say the food system is complex, the answer is as simple as what I've just said. It comes down to political will. Mm-hmm. Which leaders across the globe are willing to say, my number one priority is feeding people, not my number one priority is the defense budget? So it's an entirely new concept.
Well, you spoke about distribution of food, mm-hmm. But you also alluded to the fact that, for example, Africa has an untapped resource in terms of their ability to grow food. I know that countries like Israel were working with countries like Kenya, and they've been exporting technologies
Absolutely.
in food production. Fascinating things that I've seen, for example, where wheat can be grown from the ground up. I've seen things about grafting different types of fruit trees together. I mean, I know very little. I know that, agricultural economics,
what you're mentioning, and it's funny because I remember being on a plane like in my 20s and explaining to the person next to me, so what are you studying? And agricultural economics. Well, why would you choose that? You chose that? So
you want to be a farmer?
But you fast forward to today. Yeah. Everybody is an armchair foodie. Everyone's an armchair ag economist in a way. Everybody has an opinion today, and it's being put out there. But the point is that the food system is one of the most innovative. The food industry is one of the most innovative industries. You mentioned Israel. Why do you think they're deploying their technology? I mean, they needed to figure out their water issue. So their comparative advantage was they are one of the world leaders on water technology and irrigation. And of course, then, if they've developed that, taking that to other regions who face that same constraint and sharing that tech transfer and best practice is going to be the way we solve the insecurity.
Actually, a lot of the border disputes associated with the Jordanians, the Palestinians, the Israelis, and so on and so forth, most people don't realize water is a big issue in that.
Water is the issue.
It's the issue.
It is the issue. You need water to grow food, right? And so if you don't have water, you can't grow food.
And it's not just water. It's clean water.
It's clean water, which if you go to SDG number 6, which is what I said, water sanitation. So you start to see how actually zero hunger, SDG number 2, is impacted by our ability to meet all of those other goals.
I mean, I think that last year there was a massive massive recall of romaine lettuce. I think
Yeah, that hit at the heart. That was at the heart of the Salinas Valley. Yeah.
and I think it had to do with contaminated water. And so the water that we use in agriculture is really important. And by the year 2030, they say the water consumption levels, I believe, for agriculture globally are going to need to increase 50% over where they are today. Is that right? So how are we,
Well, let me first of all back up just to make one point on the romaine lettuce, because I grew up in Salinas Valley. So I don't want to leave people with the impression that our food system isn't safe. So we're seeing, we have, in that case, it was a situation with water, contaminated water. But what I also want to say is our food system is the safest in the world. That's the first thing. The water issue, which is interesting, you asked me at the start, Devry, tell me about yourself. If you were to add up some of my different affiliations, they might not make sense to you, but I, several years ago, was on a board called the Mountain Institute. And a lot of folks were like, why are you on this Mountain Institute? You're focused on food and ag. Well, by the way, you produce food in the mountains, but 70% of the world's fresh water comes from the mountains. And I'm incredibly thankful that growing up in the fertile valley I did, those mountains, that water that came from those mountains created alluvial fans and fed the valley. So when we think about food and agriculture, we have to think about that system that's providing for it. So why was I on the board of the Mountain Institute? Because it was working to conserve the world's mountain ecosystems. Incredibly complex.
I don't think most people realize, but I think it's 0.5% of the world's total water is fresh water that can be used for this sort of thing. And our safeguarding of that water supply is so important.
But also our ability to think about how can we take desalinization to scale. Whoop.
Oh, absolutely. You think that's possible?
Yes, anything's possible.
Okay. Very cool. Well, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Well, welcome back. We're here with Devry Boughner Vorwerk, CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies. We just finished the last segment talking about water. What other types of major issues do we need to be concerned about with regard to our food supply presently?
The higher order issue that I think is governing all the complex sub-issues is climate change. So that's squarely on the foot of the food and ag industry right now. Climate matters when it comes to being able to feed people. So you mentioned there's a whole set of sub-issues. Land use becomes one of those. When I note that actually a third of the food that's produced today is wasted, then you think, well, and then we're seeing...
Is it a third?
A third of the food produced in the world is wasted.
Really? And that's across the board?
That's across the board. So food waste and what we do with food surplus is a huge issue. We pivot over and we look at what's happening in terms of deforestation.
Or if we were able to reduce that by just 50%, how many people could we feed?
Or if we were able to actually, when we talked about 821 million people being hungry, if we were able to get that food into the hands of those folks, this is why I say there's enough food today to feed every citizen. It comes down to a matter of collective political will. So the issues that are facing, the society as it relates to, and the industry is, we've got to figure out how we don't think about ourselves just as small local units, but globally connected. So deforestation is an issue. And then when we start to think about not just that, there are also a lot of social issues that come into the supply chain in terms of how people are being treated. And the industry is being faced with increasing scrutiny. Consumers want to know what's in their food and how their food was produced. So they have these societal expectations that they're not contributing to, environmental degradation or human rights issues.
Fair trade.
Yeah. So I way back when said, well, there's free trade is fair trade. The point is that the transparency that's required of the food industry, coupled with all of these, these massive, external constraints coming from our climate crisis, are putting immense pressure on the industry to perform. I'm still optimistic that we will be able to feed the world in a sustainable way. And we talked about SDGs, zero hunger, achieve it by 2030. But that's going to take massive coordination. I'm thrilled to now be working with an organization called Global Citizen, who, if you go to their site, you take a look, any citizen in the world could go in and contribute and say, this is how I am going to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they've been able to mobilize millions of people, governments, companies, and others to start pivoting toward these centralized goals that the United Nations has pointed out for us.
Fabulous. And they have a fundraising goal also in association with what they're trying to do? Or
well, what's unique about Global Citizen is it's not a fundraising goal to fund them, the organization. Right. This was started by two really bright millennials. And, their goal is actually to get people to fund the capital infusion that needs to take place to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's, the statistics are that if we're going to end extreme poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, all these, these goals that we've set for ourselves, it's going to take $350 billion a year over the next 10 years. And where is that capital infusion going to come from? It's mostly going to come from private sector, governments, wealthy philanthropists, and then citizens also participating, which gets to, well, gee, if I'm a head of a company, I'm a CEO of a company, and I'm operating, in different parts of the world, and my business model hasn't taken account for how I'm going to contribute to investing toward that $350 billion, then I've got to back up and think about how my business is going to do that.
In the context of that, in terms of leadership in this regard, what are the issues that we're seeing that are problematic in achieving that goal?
In terms of leadership?
In terms of leadership.
Short-term thinking.
Okay.
And I could say that's across government and private sector. In particular, in private sector, where I'm sort of dedicating my new business to working with and supporting, we have CEOs who may say, "Gee, I've got good leadership intent. I want to do X, Y, or Z to contribute." But then it goes a layer deeper. Well, what about your business strategy then? Mm-hmm. If you would like to, let's say, contribute to ending deforestation, what's your business strategy doing to address that? And then going a layer deeper, have you actually allocated capital or investments that are going to contribute to that business strategy? And by the way, what are the internal incentives in your company? Are your business leaders across the globe, through their through their bonus structure, through their incentives on their profit and loss statements, their P&L, are they being incentivized to meet that business strategy, or are your incentives misaligned? So how are you getting your entire organization behind that? And I'm really optimistic about, for example, the Business Roundtable. 181 CEOs at the last part of 2019 came together and said, we realize that we can't just stand for shareholder value, making returns, and it's all about growth and making returns for our shareholders. We actually have to start looking at stakeholder value, which means the community, the communities that are impacted, our workers, broader society. If our business has some negative externalities, how are we addressing that?
And that was a fabulous development. The question is, why did they come together now?
There's this, I would like to say that there's this convergence of expectations on business now and on leaders, that they don't just focus on profit. And the enlightened leaders that get that have started to be rewarded for that.
Well, interestingly enough, when we talk about enlightened leaders, I can't say that every leader is enlightened. Especially, there are some companies that have been very innovative in being able to go global in a very effective way by becoming more diverse, metropolitan in their leadership. You had mentioned to me before the Purple Poppy Institute.
Right.
If we're going to achieve this goal, the interesting question is do we have the right people at the table? Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about your vision for this Purple Poppy Institute.
Absolutely. And I'll say from the start, we don't have the right people at the table. So the Purple Poppy Institute is an outgrowth, not an outgrowth, it's integrated into my new business. And it's something that I've had a real passion around for a long time. In fact, I wrote the business model a long time, maybe 8-10 years ago, when I started to move up the ladder in corporate America and began to realize, and especially in food and agriculture, I look around and say, wait a second, I'm the only woman here. And it's not about me. It's how am I going to ensure that there are more women at the top? Because if we don't have inclusive leadership teams at the tippy top, those folks that are designing the business strategy, that are implementing the business strategy and designing the incentives for the company to follow. If we don't have that diverse leadership at the top, then there's one way of thinking. And right now what we have, if we look across the corporate sphere and government, because that's what the Purple Poppy Institute's focused on, we have very few women at the top in leadership positions. The Purple Poppy Institute its sole purpose is to advance women into the senior most roles of business and government.
Why do you think there are very few?
Because it's very difficult, because the system just keeps perpetuating itself. There's a lot of effort going into, let's get rid of unconscious bias. Let's make sure we have a pipeline. The system is still works against women getting to the top. And it's not just, well, gee, Devry, that's great, you get women to the top. It's about the entire pipeline and all those that we bring along with us. And when you have more diverse teams, you get more diverse thinking, and then you get different outcomes. And in order for us to achieve these goals of ending extreme poverty and the sustainable development goals, we have to have diverse leadership at the top.
And that diversity is women. That diversity for a multinational corporation could also be the inclusion of people in those countries that are actually at the table.
Absolutely. It's
communicating with them.
It's women. The Purple Poppy Institute's focused on women, but that will be a diverse institute of women across all cultures, right? Because what I'm saying is international business and international government. So by just by that alone, it means it'll be an effort to get diverse leadership at the top.
Now, let me ask you this. This is interesting. We talked about this before too. The term purple poppy.
Right.
And this whole idea of
the tall poppy syndrome. So
yes.
some folks have heard of it. And the logo for DevryBV Sustainable Strategies is very personal. It's a purple poppy. Purple is a powerful color in and of itself, but it's also the color that represents International Women and International Women's Day. Purple is a blend between red and blue. And when we think about our politics, at least here in the U.S., it's, well, gee, you've got this divisive, red and blue. Well, my point is it blends. The diversity is there in the color itself, right? It is a blending of, diverse thinking and outcomes in people. And why the poppy? So if you look at the logo, my logo, the stamens are all collected like they are across a globe, which means we're all holding hands together. And there's a theory out there called the tall poppy syndrome, which is if you're really good and you stand up above the rest, right, and you're outperforming and you are the best at your game and you are focused on all the right things and you're incredibly visible. There's a point in business where people will say you're too visible. You're standing up too much and look, you're making everybody else look bad. And I would submit that as it relates to women rising up through the ranks, of course we're visible because there's very few of us. And it ends up working against women. What happens in the tall poppy syndrome is the poppy gets cut off. And it happens time and time again. And my message under the Purple Poppy Institute is stand up and stand out, right? And that's how we're going to create this force so that more women can make it to the top.
And wouldn't you think that for an organization that's smart, they want those people. They should want those people that stand up and stand out.
They should.
Because they're the ones they're the thinkers, they're the innovators, they're the ones that are going to build the future, right?
Well, they're the ones that are going to bring the others along with them. And some organizations do it well, and others still have a steep learning curve. It's not enough just to insert a few programs. This is about getting at the heart of the company culture.
I know that you've been at the World Economic Forum.
Right.
And, here's a group of people that have come together to address global economic issues. Is there limitations to what you have observed in terms of the potential for them to have an impact based on the people that are at the table there? At
the World Economic Forum.
Yes.
So it's actually coming up this week, and their theme this year is to focus on stakeholder value, right? Yes, there's I think it's 20% of the attendees. I think at times when I've been, it's been less. It's noticeable when you're walking the streets and who's inside, meetings, et cetera, is that this is a male-dominated global society. And so you notice it when you're there that, there's not a lot of women at the table. And why does that matter? Because the WEF is putting a lot of energy on gender equality. And in fact, a couple years ago, sent a very visible signal that the chairs for that year were all women leaders. The problem is not the WEF. The problem is that those organizations that are attending don't have enough women at the top. So when WEF makes encouragement to bring more women to the table, which they do, these companies look in their organizations and say, well, but I don't have those people. The WEF brings in the senior most leaders. And so the problem is these companies look into their own companies and say, I don't have enough senior most leaders.
Do you see a diversity, though, in terms of representation also from across the world at the World Economic Forum?
Oh, it's magnificent. Yes, There's a diversity of representation. Now, that said, I think maybe that's coming through my narrow lens. Asian representation is on the uptick in the World Economic Forum. What I like about what Klaus Schwab does and the whole WEF team is that they are incredibly conscientious of all of these issues that we talk about in terms of enlightened leadership and inequality and all of that. But whether all of the members are collectively responding is a different question. And I'm a member of the Young Global Leader. I was honored to be a Young Global Leader named in 2014, and when you look at how the WEF has begun choosing, who makes it into this group, they're deliberate. I think my class was 50-50 women. They're deliberate about the geographies they're choosing, and what's magnificent about the bringing together these young global, these are people who are, I mean, President Macron's a YGL, right? And we have people who are doing amazing things in society that are YGLs. And when they bring us all together, these are going to be the future leaders. That is a diverse group. So you can be optimistic. Now, the question is, what institutions do we go into?
I think that's great too, because what it is, though, it's also acknowledging and encouraging young leadership to do the right thing, build the right future. I like that.
It's definitely a peace building exercise to have these colleagues all around the world doing amazing things.
And I've heard that, and one of the things I love about these forums too, and I've heard about this too, is that, yes, they have presentations during the forums, but a lot of the progress happens behind the scenes. A lot of world leaders that are there, a lot of interactions and relationship development that occurs that helps to foster this change that we need. And so it seems to me like, gosh, you probably go to the forum, you're like, wow, this is great. And then you leave. It's like, now where do we go from here?
Well, one thing to note is it's not like that. It's a whole system throughout the whole year. People criticize Davos. You'll see this next week. All these stories about the elite, the 1% meeting, and frankly, the World Economic Forum is a year-long program. So you have regional World Economic Forum meetings. You have different groups, different councils, different agenda councils that meet collectively. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that the World Economic Forum is not doing something to advance these sustainable development goals.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's not just one meeting. Davos is kind of a culmination and a start to the new calendar year.
Okay, so it's a capstone event.
It's a capstone event. Yeah. But I assure you, as YGLs, I was just mentioning to you before we got online today, I was co-creating some solutions with my colleague David Hertz in Brazil yesterday and he and I founded an effort in the World Economic Forum to launch a global movement called social gastronomy. We're working that whole movement, that's working every day. And we're engaging every day. It was the World Economic Forum that brought David and I together, a chef from Rio, Brazil, and at the time a food industry executive, to say, how could we together launch something that forges change? So it's powerful.
Fascinating. Well, we're going to take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
We'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, welcome back. We're here with Devry Boughner Vorwerk, CEO of DevryBV Sustainable Strategies. In this segment, I want to begin talking about some phrases or words that I know have meaning to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first one is organizational courage.
So organizational courage is an element of my new business, and it's about being able to align a leader's intent with the final outcome. And that's really critical in this particular moment in time, because I mentioned the business roundtable earlier, for example, CEOs standing up and saying, I want to contribute positively beyond just shareholder value. I want to contribute positively toward these extreme issues like climate change or hunger, et cetera. So organizational courage is about, first of all, that CEO, she or he had to have courage to stand up and say that. Courage because external stakeholders are now going to expect more from that CEO in the company, but courage also because internally, this is where the organizational part comes in, it's really a risk for a leader to make that statement, because that means that leader has to get her entire organization behind her. Mm-hmm. And so it's organizational courage is about having
that organization we're talking about isn't just the employees, it's the investors.
It's
the
all
board,
of the stakeholders.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. So it starts with the leader being courageous. The leaders of our time should be tested through the lens of whether or not they have courage to do the right thing. So that's the first thing. You have a leader who stands up and is courageous. And then it's, is the business model in line with that courage?
Well, let me ask you this. This comes to the next term, culture.
Culture. That's part of organizational courage, is leader intent. Okay, fine, you can get the business model behind it. You may even get the board mostly behind the leadership intent. Let's just assume companies' values are in line, then culture hits. Is your culture going to actually facilitate that leadership intent? And that's where leaders should start. Not that they should say, I need to make sure, before I get out and make this, that my culture is in line. But for the long haul, these leaders have to do massive cultural assessments. It's not enough to do a static assessment. Is there a culture of optionality such that some of these other leaders below who are expected to carry out just blow it off? What's that? Is that culture actually facilitating that CEO's success or not? And that's a really difficult issue to grapple with.
Educational institutions have the benefit, oftentimes, they're research institutions, of being able to do, in essence, longitudinal long-term research. Organizations typically are very short-term oriented, like we talked about earlier, in terms of the stakeholders, shareholders, for example, expecting, certain things to happen in 3 months, 6 months, 10 years, trying to achieve, the goals of the SDGs, for example. That's a long period of time, longer than usually the tenure of most CEOs by far. When you speak of organizational courage, there's also the issue of restraining forces, keeping those people, even with the right intent, from moving forward. What do you observe in terms of the backlash? There are people out there that are very self-focused egoists. Mm-hmm. Is that very prevalent out there? Are there, like we talk about these great luminaries that want to change the world and make things better? What are the forces we're dealing with on the other side?
Well, let's just take it to a basic level. Yes, ego, self-interest is at the heart of why organizations can't move forward. And they exist in every organization, whether that's a company or academia, et cetera.
I mean, to give you an example of this too, and I just want to interject this, in Minnesota, in the northern part of the state, they're talking about doing sulfide mining to extract minerals. And we have a tremendously rich mine deposit that we've discovered in the northern part of the state. Sulfide mining has the potential of releasing sulfuric acid into the soil and into our water systems, and it would be devastating if that happened.
Yeah.
We haven't done that type of mining characteristically in the northern part of the state, but it would produce an enormous number of jobs for a period of time until we've depleted those resources. There are pressures to create those jobs, and thinking about the impacts on the ecology. Well, there's different perspectives. There's some that think that it's an overreaction to be worried about these types of things. And they may even not just be saying it's an overreaction. They may be trying to drive closure and shut down any type of dissent that might have any concerns that they raise. How powerful are those groups today?
Well, I think what you're raising, whether it's sulfite mining or another issue that a company or a government has to deal with, is that it takes a complex set of stakeholders to drive outcomes. And in the case of when I say sort of sustainability or sustainable development goals, and we're all trying to meet these broad goals for society, lots of folks will say, how do you define this? And really it's about acting with environmental integrity, social integrity, and economic integrity. And at the heart of every decision, whether it's a business decision you're talking about or a different one, the leaders have to look through that lens. How is it impacting environmental, economic, and social integrity? And then have to have the courage to make the right decision. And sometimes there's a graying of a space. You're bringing up jobs versus environment, and this is going on a daily basis.
Well, you even brought up to me in a private conversation about if we're able to grow meat in a lab.
Oh, right. So I can bring it up. So this is what I'm talking about. So when you think about, we were talking about organizational courage, having a conversation around what's the right thing to do, it starts to get complex because leaders will run into philosophical divides, philosophical roadblocks. So we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for example. We want to drive down the amount of carbon that's being emitted into the atmosphere. And so there's a group of folks who say no more cattle production. Well, we talked about jobs. We talked about, feeding people. Mm-hmm. And then there's another group that says, I can grow meat in a lab. And then you think as a business leader, what's the right thing to do here? Growing meat in a laboratory may open a whole set of other ethical questions that you have to ask. And then we take that to, chickens versus, in a laboratory versus outside. A huge part of the equation for
there's whole economies
based on that.
Yes.
And by the way, the egg, is a perfect protein for folks who don't have access to that. But should we then stop the investment in plant-based proteins? In my view, these are the types of in the ag industry, in the food industry, these conversations are taking place rapidly, and in some instances, the right answer is both. The right answer is both. And so it's where these, a CEO may say, gee, okay, how do I make the right decision here? Do I invest? Global Citizen says we need $350 billion in investments every year to ensure we're ending extreme poverty.
But how do you, when we're dealing with these situations, though, in the midst of those things, when a corporation is hearing about meat in a lab that is into chicken farms, they're thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, they're going to make us obsolete. So there's polarization that I assume that initially occurs where there's sides to the argument. How do we bring them together to
and that's where
work together?
This notion of having courage to lean into the tough conversations is really important for leaders of the future. We've had technological disruption through both of our lives, right? So one that's often used is, going from the buggy whip to the car. And oh my gosh, we can't go to the car because then that puts all the buggy whip, drivers out of business, or ATM to bank teller to an ATM. Oh no, if we set all these ATMs in place, then what does that mean for the jobs? And so that's where having a great understanding of how can we future outcomes. when we're sitting there looking at technologies that could come into play, say in the food and ag space, so plant-based proteins versus the chicken and the egg,
Mm-hmm.
how do we future the work? I mean, the big part of this is being able to future the workforce of the future,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't have a technology be introduced without that company who's even investing in that technology thinking about the technological pathway. And so what's happening a lot right now, which is why I think there's a lot of stress and conflict in the food industry, is that not all sides are sitting together saying it's both. The way that we move forward in the food system is we raise cattle and we find different ways to produce proteins.
So let me bring in my next
Yeah.
keywords. And you're very familiar with these, I'm sure. And there's an interesting philosophical consideration behind them.
Okay.
Pure capitalism versus pure socialism.
Right. You'll be you'll laugh, and maybe I told you this earlier. I recently picked up a copy of the Communist Manifesto because there's been a lot of conversations around how we organize societies, and there's been a question around whether capitalism serves society in a way that actually makes people better off. And I am a big believer that moral capitalism is how we get ourselves out of a lot of these really thorny social and environmental and economic issues. And what I mean by moral is that at the end of the day, there's markets will organize societies, and incentives will be there to produce outcomes. But markets alone can't do it. You also have to have governments along the side playing their roles. Mm-hmm. And when we start to introduce this notion, not just start, it's been
Mm-hmm.
around. You know, I'm on the board of the Co-Roundtable, which has pushed for 25 years principles of moral capitalism, principles that business leaders should follow, that government should follow, and actually that citizens should follow in this society. So there's just, in my mind, there's no other way to organize. We've seen it. And when it comes to food and agriculture, we've seen how a centralized system where maybe one actor who's in government says, this is how much we're going to produce, doesn't work. And millions of people die as a result. So it gets back to also what we talked about earlier when I said to you, I believe we should be sitting down and engaging North Korea, for example. Oh, but they're a communist society. Oh, right. But we've seen how well that's working for its people on the ground. So we should be engaging societies who have different government views.
So this brings up another phrase. Capitalism cannot work without good governance. Something that you talked about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Maybe explain that for us.
Well, capitalism or markets
Mm-hmm.
have to have rules. It has to be a rules-based system. Markets can't just operate on their own without any sort of moral or value base in society. And that's the role of government. The role of government at its core is to protect its people. And the way that they protect its people is to interface with business and put different types of rules of the road. In fact, business wants rules of the road because the good actors in business don't like the bad actors who aren't playing by the rules.
Okay.
Hence the reason we should all get back to the table at the World Trade Organization and reinforce the global rules-based system.
Okay. And with that, you had an interesting phrase. Is it profit over purpose or purpose over profit?
Purpose is the moral compass of a company or an organization. Purpose should always reign. That said, you can have a company that's profitable because they're focused on their purpose. And this is where I think people get wrangled. Well, gee, companies, they're just focused on themselves. If you have courageous leaders, if companies have thought about what is my purpose and my greater offering to society, and then build a business around that, you will be profitable. Now, business has negative externalities. So there's, there's a whole positive side. We're creating jobs. We're We're creating life-saving vaccines, or all of these really great things that businesses provide society. But businesses can't deny they also have negative externalities. There might be runoff or pollution, or as long as business is addressing those and not saying, well, look, we're doing all these good things, but we're not willing to mitigate the negative externalities. If they're not willing to accept that they have to pay for those negative externalities, then they're going based solely on profit.
Interesting. So in wrapping up, if you were to summarize the most important lessons that we discussed today for our viewers, what would you say they would be?
I think it's take a people-centric approach to leadership, a human-centered approach to leadership. That at the end of the day, whether you're at the top of a global organization or you're working locally in a community, we're all here to ensure that people are treated ethically, fairly, and that they have what they need in terms of their basic human rights to survive. So it's about human-centered leadership.
Okay. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Well, we've talked for a good amount of time about a lot of issues, different philosophies on how to solve them. But I'd like to bring it back to a very basic level, which is for your viewers, having them spend some time asking themselves the question, what is my purpose in life and in what I do in life, and how is it laddering up to achieving these sustainable development goals? What's my contribution to contributing to a more peaceful, prosperous society by 2030?
Can everyone make a contribution?
Of course. Everyone could sit down today and say, I get it. I get my place in my community, in my global society, and I'm going to make this commitment to SDG number 2, zero hunger. This is what I'm going to do.
Does a small commitment make a difference?
What do you think?
Of course.
Sometimes it's hard for us because we feel like we're caught in our own universe. And I think that's the beauty of being able to lift your head up and think globally. We're all global actors, even at the local level.
That's very good. Well, Devry, thanks for joining us today. This has been fabulous.
Thanks for having me. It's been a joy to be here. Thanks for the interest.
It's a pleasure.